Hello, Scoobies! So this is like the second episode in my Book of Shadows prompts series that I'm doing, which is similar to When Magic Can't Help You, except this is prompts for your Book of Shadows. So I had somebody message me on Facebook and ask me, well, my Book of Shadows is filling up and I don't know what to do. And they have a similar leather-bound book to me. Go out and buy another one, and there you go. Now you have two Book of Shadows. That's generally what I do. You never really want to throw out any of your older Book of Shadows because you have it's a record of your progress in the craft from where you were to where you are now. At least that's how I look at mine. So today's prompt is going to be about recipes. And I'm talking about cooking. So let's say your grandmother has a recipe for fish that's been handed down from her mother and her mother before her. And she gives your mother this recipe and then your mother gives you this recipe. So maybe it's your mother's. You get the point. So that is something that you could put in your Book of Shadows. Your Book of Shadows doesn't have to be about spells and charms and moon phases and herbs and whatever else you have in there. You have to think about it as a journey, a collection of information. It doesn't always have to be witchy. That's the other thing. Like I said in my first video, one of the prompts I gave you was to write a journal entry. Okay, and write down, working, like just starting a journal entry about anything relating to your craft. Or in general, maybe your life is at a shitty point right now and you need a place to write that down. Write it in your Book of Shadows. So with this recipe, you could write the recipe in your Book of Shadows, anywhere in your book, it doesn't matter. And as you make this fish recipe, maybe there's something you substitute out, or maybe there's something you add to it. So in the margins or the footer or whatever, write down your little additions. And think about, maybe it calls for thyme, but you used basil. And be like, it tasted really great with basil in like the margin, instead of using thyme, or whatever the case may be. I mean, you don't normally use basil with fish, but each to their own. So that's your Book of Shadows prompt for today. And the reason that I went with recipe is because I wanted a food recipe. We have our incense, we have our teas, we have our syrups, we have our tinctures, we have our oils, and those are all more or less witchy based. And cooking can also be witchy based. Don't get me wrong. I mean, there's plenty of kitchen witches that use the spices and the herbs and the things that they grow in their cooking, and they put magical intentions into it and so on and so forth. And that's perfectly awesome. But where I'm coming from with this recipe idea is something a little less witchy. Something a little more personal and to the heart. So put in your favorite recipe into your Book of Shadows. And if you want to put more than one, then feel free. If you want to put in a recipe for a soup or a meat or, a dinner recipe or a breakfast recipe or a dessert recipe or whatever the recipe is, as long as it's food-based. That's the only contingent here, is that it has to be a food-based recipe. As long as it's a food-based recipe, put it in your Book of Shadows, like one of your absolute favorites, or maybe you have multiple. And then as you make them, and you find yourself substituting things out, or you find yourself adding a little bit of extra, make sure you write that down in your Book of Shadows as well, okay? So I hope that this gives you a Book of Shadows prompt, and I hope that you actually go through with it. I would love to know how many of you actually found your favorite recipe or one that was handed down and put it in your Book of Shadows, and maybe what changes you made to it if you want to share that. That would be awesome. So we do have one more video to do, and then we should be good to go.